I must admit, I'm feeling a little guilty being here today, right now in this beautiful theater with all of you amazing people hearing incredible stories of technology and how the world is changing. We have 3 teams right now that are out around the world, down on the Venezuela border, feeding refugees coming across into Colombia. This is the route that they walk for about 10 days. Goes up to about 11,000 feet where it's freezing cold at night, and in search of a better life, ability to feed their families. In Mozambique right now, where a devastating cyclone has displaced hundreds of thousands of people, our team is now on the ground cooking in many of the camps, and we're just getting ramped up. And closer to home, here in Nebraska, this is Shayla. Her family lost their home in the flooding in Nebraska, and our team has been out, in some cases having to use ATVs to go deliver meals into communities that are still cut off because of the flooding. In the past year, we've served about 5 million meals here in the United States and around the world. And it's been an incredible journey, and you heard some of the story. But I wanted to sort of step back a little bit and give you some context of how we started, where we began, and how we do this work. So our founder, Chef Jose Andres, who some of you may know, he's got some restaurants nearby. He went down to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010 and saw that there was this gap where the folks that know food the best, that understand food, that understand how it relates to culture and people and know how to prepare it, weren't involved in the process of solving some of the challenges around food. So he started learning, started working small project by project, and started to see what he could do as a chef and other chefs, bringing their expertise to the table, and also leveraging the experience of the private sector. Ultimately, at heart, Jose is an entrepreneur. He has restaurants all around the country and growingly across the world. But things changed in 2017 when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, as many of you know, devastated the island. Category 5 hurricane, an island that was already struggling with economic issues, with failing infrastructure. And we arrived on the ground about 3 days after the hurricane had hit, not really knowing what to expect, honestly. Jose and I packed about 3 days worth of clothes. We thought we'd be there for a couple of days. We'd go home. We'd maybe help out a little bit. And what we found was that the system was broken. Everything was in paralysis. Nobody could get anything to the island. The emergency response organizations didn't know how to start serving a problem of that scale. FEMA told us that about 2 million people needed food, potentially 3 times a day, 6 million meals a day, which is unfathomable. And they just couldn't get the resources in place to do it. So we did what chefs do, which is we just started somewhere. We showed up at the local food distributor and started buying their food. We started small. We started getting requests for 100 meals here, 30 meals here, started building a team, a small team. And we went from about 20 volunteers in a small restaurant to 20,000 volunteers. We went from 1 kitchen around the island to 21 kitchens around the island. And at the peak, we're doing about 150,000 meals per day, cooking and delivering them. This is the big arena in San Juan that we finally convinced the local authorities to let us take over, that was preparing about 75,000 meals alone. Jose jokes that arenas, including Capital One Center, which is right nearby, they aren't sports venues. They're giant restaurants that happen to have entertainment that you watch while you eat food. That's where they make most of their money. So, the big question of all of this is why? Why was this necessary? Why, why was this unique? And what we found and what we learned in this process is that too often this is the default. This is what FEMA was distributing. Some of you might have seen this, these packs Thankfully, they are in the process of redoing some of these things, trying to figure out how to do it better. But Vienna sausages, Cheez-Its, and Baby Ruths, fine foods, maybe not in the aftermath of a disaster when people have no access to grocery stores, restaurants, or electricity or water to cook with. And these are meals ready to eat. These are what our military survives on when they're out in combat areas. And unfortunately, this is still the default for many emergencies for our own citizens. I actually took this photo in a Red Cross shelter in North Carolina, where these boxes were all stacked up, and most people couldn't eat them because the shelter had a lot of elderly, had a lot of children, and they can't eat this food at all. So we want to change the game. We want to change the system, and this is what we're doing. So we're cooking fresh food, hot food, with local ingredients, and delivering that to people in need in times of crisis, and doing it at scale. And fruit. Fruit's a big piece of it. A bag of chips is great, but what we found actually is fruit is actually very much desired by kids, and it's a great way to get some healthy food out there. It's easy, it's grab and go, and so we try to put fruit with everything that we do. So how do we do this? Well, one of the things that we do is we try to, as much as possible, get on the ground if we can before something happens to get in position. This was in North Carolina before Hurricane Florence hit. We were down in Wilmington, and we convinced Cisco to give us 3 big tractor trailers full of food. They were going to take the trailers back, and we convinced them to leave them so we could use them as storage. And so we were there on the ground, ready to go. We have a network of chefs that we leverage both here in the United States and increasingly around the world. And the thing that's so amazing about chefs, and many of you who've been to restaurants probably see this and understand this, is that chefs operate in chaos. I mean, this is what they do for a living. And so they actually are often most comfortable in chaos. And so in disasters, it is just a natural ability to get the work done, which is amazing. And we leverage technology. Jose, as you can see here, loves maps. Sometimes our maps are a lot more rudimentary than the ones you just saw before, but when we don't have connectivity, we try to do what we can do. But it really helps guide us. Once we get on the ground, we start mapping out the need. We start understanding where the resources are, where the people are, and what's needed. One of the things that we found is that when a hurricane's coming, when something bad is going to happen, we sort of assume that everybody's going to evacuate. But the reality is that people don't. People don't have the means to evacuate. They don't want to leave their things. People don't trust the government in many cases, unfortunately. And so even when you have a big storm coming, whether it's in North Carolina or Florida, 80% of the population didn't actually leave the impacted area. And so the reality is that as much as we want to sort of assume that it's going to be clear, a response is going to be needed. So we try to do what we can do. We leverage what we can. We try to tap into resources on the ground. This is the SWAT team helping us deliver food to a shelter in North Carolina. And we start to build out our maps, including what other folks are doing as well, like the Red Cross and Salvation Army, and really getting eyes on the ground into communities. So going into communities, talking to people, recognizing what's needed. Has anybody come and seen them yet? What support have they seen? What are they missing? And then try to kind of collect as much of that data as possible and then feed it back to other organizations. And we build these routes. So this right here is one of our distribution routes where basically every single day at around the same time, we would have a vehicle that would go and stop in these points and deliver food in these communities, which meant that the local communities could then know that we're coming, which obviously is very helpful, and especially when they don't have access to anything for days and days and days. This is often what people are living in. This is Susan. She was actually in her bed when the hurricane hit in Florida and completely destroyed everything, and somehow she survived miraculously. And we can't do it alone. So one of the things that we try to do as much as possible is leverage, what resources we can access. And we don't say no. The Red Cross told us that they couldn't get meals to a shelter because of the flooding, so we called up the National Guard. And this is the National Guard driving through some high floodwaters with our meals in the back of the truck to get it to some of the shelters in Whiteville, North Carolina, because the alternative was no food for folks, especially at-risk populations. And so do what we can. And we find ourselves feeding first responders. This is in the Emergency Operations Center in Bay County in Florida, so as Hurricane Michael was approaching. And you'd think that there'd be some plan for feeding people, especially the first responders who were going to be there on the ground. And time after time after time, we've seen that unfortunately there's not. In these types of scenarios, there is so much happening and so much going on that food becomes an afterthought. And thankfully, we were here and we were able to support both the staff in the Emergency Operations Center, National Guard who were staged there, other state and local agencies. We went out into the communities. This is a police station that had no power and no food, and they were there trying to support the local community as much as possible. And during the Paradise Fire up in Chico, California, after the fire devastated Paradise, we were there feeding the firefighters and first responders that were working there. And we sort of adopted this mantra, which Jose actually stole from the Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, modified it a little bit, but basically, this is how we see ourselves right now. But not just us. I mean, World Central Kitchen is just one component of what needs to be a collective, collaborative response, working with our government agencies, working with other organizations, both local and national, but that we need to be there. And that's taken us to a lot of places. So this is Guatemala after the volcano last year. They're actually digging into a house, so you can sort of get a scale of how much came down from that volcano and just completely covered and obliterated a town. They opened about 31 shelters, some of them informal, all of them without food. We were able to get up and running and feeding all 31 of those shelters within 2 days, leveraging existing resources on the ground, hiring food trucks, putting local Guatemalan chefs to work, and doing whatever we could to reach out into all of these places, and in the process, also mapping out the needs as we were doing it. Indonesia last year went through a series of huge disasters that you might have seen. We were able to get on the ground with our team. That's Alejandro, who's actually Puerto Rican. We met when he showed up at our kitchen as we were cooking in Puerto Rico and is now actually down in Colombia feeding refugees from Venezuela. But getting a kitchen up and running in Indonesia, where we were able to go out. This is in Palu after the tsunami hit, and more recently in West Java after the other tsunami hit. We were able to get food to about a dozen schools. The schools were able to reopen back up, and the kids were able to go to school because that's where they would get their meal for the day. More recently, we found ourselves on the border, the Mexican border in Tijuana. And this is sort of a new area for us, this idea of a man-made disaster versus a natural disaster. But the situation is generally always the same. You have people that are displaced, people that are fleeing, in this case, violence or extreme poverty, looking for some way to survive. We organized a Christmas for them in one of the shelters, which was pretty great. And we're still down there now working on longer-term capacity building, training, doing some culinary training, and going to have about a 6-week program for people to learn the skills, because many of them end up staying in Mexico and working, and so a way to support some of that influx. And more recently, as was mentioned, feeding our federal workers during the government shutdown. We worked with a network of about 400 restaurants in 35 states across the country to support and provide free meals, in addition to what we were doing here in Washington, D.C. And what we found is that in a lot of cases, the model that we built originally in Puerto Rico, we could take and replicate and use in all of these responses and be able to do it at scale to provide fresh, hot, nutritious meals. And so what I want to leave you with today is this idea that it's time for a new model. The way that we were doing things 50, 60 years ago doesn't need to be the same now. That we have the capabilities, we have the technology, we have the expertise to be able to apply to these challenges. Jose often jokes that, actually not jokes, he says very seriously, that in the aftermath of a medical emergency, who do we send in? We send in doctors, of course. You wouldn't think of anything else. And yet after or during a food emergency, we're not sending in the people that know food the best, that know how to prepare it, that understand it, that culturally know what's relevant, and to be able to do it at scale. And so that's really what we're trying to do, because ultimately food is not just calories, right? Food is something that nourishes not just the body, but also the soul. And we really believe that that we can do better. And so leveraging new technology, leveraging the expertise, leveraging the private sector and supply chain, and the resources that are already there, in addition to innovations that are coming, like what we just saw with HiveMapper, really doing what needs to be done to make sure that everybody has a hot plate of food. So thank you very much for your time. Happy to share more. I'll be around for a little bit. Thank you.